He promised he was going to be the great Prime Minister of reconciliation, that he was going to do things completely differently. He would usher in a new era of idealism, and that Canadians could take him at his word. That would involve taking responsibility for one's own failures. When he didn't do so, he proved that he has failed to live up to the expectations he deliberately and meticulously set in the last election. Furthermore, by trying to blame the first female Indigenous Attorney General for his own behavior, he proved that what many have long suspected, that his talk about reconciliation has been nothing more than drama and theater. Yes, we know he's given sobbing speeches, he's acted with great symbolism. We know that he can put on a show for the cameras. That's what he did as a drama teacher. He acted. But there's a difference between acting and action. And actions speak louder than words. So let me just examine the approach that this Prime Minister has taken to using First Nations people for his own political objectives. I quote from the Rolling Stone magazine, and the magazine's reporter asked a question about his boxing match with Patrick Brazeau, the now senator in the upper chamber. Notice the descriptive language that the Rolling Stone reports after he was asked about that question. The Prime Minister, it writes, mischievously smiled when I asked how much of the boxing match had been planned out. It was not random, he says. I wanted someone who would be a good foil. We stumbled upon the scrappy, tough guy senator from an Indigenous community. He fit the bill. It was a very nice counterpoint. The Prime Minister says this with the calculation of a CFO in a company budget markup session. Quote, I saw it as the right kind of narrative, the right story to tell, he says. Let's just capture that again. I wanted someone who would be a good foil. And we stumbled upon the scrappy, tough guy senator from an Indigenous community. He fit the bill. And it was a very nice counterpoint. The Prime Minister said, with the calculation of a CFO in a company budget markup session, I saw it as the right kind of narrative, the right kind of story. Exactly what I said earlier. A drama teacher putting on a production, telling a story about his grandeur at the expense of a so-called scrappy, tough guy from an Indigenous community. But you know what's much more disgusting is what he was since caught on tape saying. And I'll share it with the House. And wanting to shame Mr. Brazeau, the scrappy, tough guy from the Indigenous community, the Prime Minister cut his hair, which was part of the bet at the outcome of the boxing match. And I'm going to quote the Prime Minister here. We're both known for our hair on the Hill. Let's say the loser gets a haircut, the Prime Minister said of the bet, adding to Brazeau that Brazeau resisted back a little bit, pointing out that hair has a cultural significance for First Nations people. And I said, I know. That's why I proposed it. When a warrior cuts his hair, it's a sign of shame. So it's very apropos. That's the Prime Minister of Reconciliation. Let me read that again. Prime Minister added that Brazeau resisted a little bit the haircut bet. You know, pointing out that hair has a cultural significance for First Nations peoples. And I, the Prime Minister said, I know. That's why I proposed it. When a warrior cuts his hair, it's a sign of shame. So it's very apropos. Just digest that a little bit. Yes. He didn't just want to win the boxing match. He wanted to do it against an Indigenous person. And then he wanted to cut his hair because it was a cultural symbol of shame, of him dominating over that person, of him humiliating that person. Now put aside whether or not Mr. Brazeau agreed to participate in the fight. He did. But it is the pleasure with which the Prime Minister embraced this opportunity to shame someone on the basis of their cultural traditions. That is the Prime Minister. That is the heart of the so-called reconciliation Prime Minister. And this is not lost on First Nations leaders. Let me quote from an interview by Mercedes Stephenson. Joining me now to discuss this, we're referring now to the affair with SNC-Lavalin, is Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. Grand Chief, you had a chance to see that video, and she was talking about a video in relationship to the scandal. What did you make of it? Grand Chief Phillip says of the Prime Minister, well, it was very deeply disappointing to know and understand that at this late date in the game, that the vision and promises of the Prime Minister that he announced in October 2015 have not come to pass. All of the promises and commitments that he made have simply been set aside, and now that he's under tremendous pressure from the former Attorney General, the SNC-Lavalin issue, the Prime Minister is really revealing himself to be who he really is, which is a very self-centered, conceited, arrogant individual. And I think that was demonstrated with his very smug, mean-spirited response to the Grassy Narrows demonstrator. That situation is simply tragic. Many, many people have died. Many people are handicapped and living with the legacy of mercury poisoning. And, you know, he's such an arrogant individual. It's very disturbing and very disappointing, end quote. Now, that respected chief was referring to the Prime Minister's disgusting comment at a recent $1,500 a ticket fundraiser, where he was speaking to a bunch of well-connected Liberal lobbyists and wealthy donors, and a courageous whistleblower stood up and warned him about the issue of mercury poisoning in an Aboriginal community. And he had the audacity to laugh about the incident and say, thank you for your donation. And then he said again, thank you for your donation to the Liberal Party of Canada. He actually said it twice. And of course, the millionaire Liberals in the room burst into uproarious laughter, thinking it was just hilarious as she was being dragged out by security, that he would make a joke at the expense of the people suffering from mercury poisoning on a First Nations reserve and say, thank you for your donation. You know, isn't it nice that he and his wealthy friends can gather together and luxuriate at a beautiful reception with fine wine and other delicious liqueurs that they can enjoy in the comfort and safety of a place where the water is not poisoned by mercury, but that, God forbid, someone should stand up and confront him when he thinks no one's looking because he didn't know he was on camera. And the real Prime Minister reveals himself when he's not the drama teacher we all see on television. Mercedes Stephenson then asked, the Prime Minister did apologize for his tone and what he said in that video. I take it that that apology doesn't mean much to you. the response from the chief, no, you know, I think it was this late stage in this game. Again, we're used to the Prime Minister's apologies and alligator tears. It's not about apologies, it's about getting it right. I think the chief made a very good point there, the Grand Chief, excuse me, when he talked about the Prime Minister's alligator tears, because the Prime Minister has substituted his ability to generate these phony tears on demand for real action on behalf of the people, the First Nations people. They weren't looking for more water to pour out of his eyeballs. They were looking for fresh water and clean water that they could drink on reserve. And he didn't provide any of that. Instead, he provided a disgusting display of mockery against those same people. Mercedes Stephenson, how would you describe the relationship between the government and Indigenous communities under the Prime Minister compared to previous governments? Well, I think it started off with a great sense of hope and anticipation that the Prime Minister and his government was going to embrace the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the TRC calls to action were going to be fully implemented. That there was going to be a seismic change with respect to our jurisdictional issues and the other issues around energy in this country. And as time has moved forward, all of those promises have simply swept aside and have not come to pass. And here we are, 6 months out from the next election, and we're faced with the Prime Minister's government totally unraveling, coming apart at the seams. And without question, the sun is setting on this Prime Minister. Mercedes Stephenson goes on, do you think it's that the government isn't committed to reconciliation, or that it's simply much more difficult than we were anticipating, and it takes more time and more effort to solve what were some very complex problems? The Grand Chief. Well, quite honestly, I think that the clip that we witnessed, the most disturbing part of that clip, aside from the smugness and mean-spirited remark on the part of the Prime Minister, was the spontaneous applause from Liberal Party members who were attending, which to me is a reflection on the heart and soul of the Liberal Party, which for many, many decades had this arrogant sense of entitlement, that they were a national party that is so accustomed to forming government, and I think that's the central issue here. The Prime Minister paid a lot of lip service, you know, to this historic change, to this historic changes, but I don't think the party itself was, you know, that much in support of those visionary statements made by the Prime Minister in the early days of his tenure. So then Ms. Stephenson asked the Grand Chief about the former Attorney General, and he said, and asks, is it because you're upset with what happened there, or is it also because the government's not meeting its promises that you feel that they put out there? It's both, replied the Grand Chief. But believe me, British Columbians, the Indigenous community in British Columbia, we're so proud of the former Attorney General. We were so proud when the former Attorney General was appointed as Justice Minister. We have had the privilege and honor of working with her, and we know her to be deeply committed, very conscientious, and an absolute workhorse. And she's very meticulous in terms of preparation and keeping records of meetings and so on and so forth. And we knew immediately that the efforts to smear the former Attorney General were politically motivated, and needless to say, we were deeply angered by how terribly she was treated as an Indigenous woman. When the Prime Minister said there was nothing more dear to him than relationships with Indigenous peoples, and in a very misleading way, has always held himself as a feminist, end quote. And of course, then Ms. Stephenson finishes up the interview. I encourage anyone to go watch the Grand Chief's words, and they will find them very revealing indeed about the Prime Minister's true motivations and his true character in respect of the issue of reconciliation. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Prime Minister's decision to trample all over the will of First Nations peoples in the approval or rejection of pipelines. First Nations people, supported the Northern Gateway Pipeline. It was a wonderful opportunity for northern British Columbian First Nations communities to generate billions of dollars for schools and hospitals and thousands of jobs for young people who are bursting with potential but lack opportunity to fulfill it. You think of the Aboriginal population of the country is the youngest of any demographic. And so we have this spectacular opportunity for Canada to address its aging population and retiring workforce by expanding opportunity to young First Nations people to take on excellent jobs of the future. And many of those jobs, good, high-paying jobs, will be in natural resource sectors. Building pipelines, pipe fitting, welding, operating heavy machinery to install those pipelines. And of course, rightfully collecting royalties from the resulting economic wealth these projects generate. One thing that a lot of people who oppose natural resource projects don't realize is their potential to pay royalties to the rightful owners of the land, in many cases, First Nations communities. That's why energy companies regularly sign agreements to not only pay revenue directly to First Nations governments that they can be used to build schools and hospitals and clinics and other services, but also to employ the young, youthful workforce in those communities. And so let me start with the Northern Gateway Pipeline, which the Prime Minister vetoed, even though it had already been approved, and even though the majority of First Nations communities on the pathway of the pipeline had supported it. Many of them had benefit agreements that they had signed with the company Enbridge in order to share in the prosperity that would come from that project. It is a constitutional obligation to consult with First Nations people when their interests are directly affected by a natural resources project in or around their lands. That happened in the case of the Northern Gateway. And the project was approved. The Prime Minister ran in the last election, though, on killing the project because he wanted to take advantage of a hardcore anti-development agenda that was popular with the far-left base of his party in certain parts of the country. He also wanted to take advantage of the copious foreign dollars that were pouring in to Canada to influence the outcome of the last election against resource development. And we now know why these foreign interests don't want Canadian resources to get to market, because they're profiting from keeping Canada landlocked in its oil and gas sector. Why? Because Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Venezuela, and numerous other foreign producers of oil don't want to have to compete with Canada. One easy way to prevent that competition is to block the construction of pipelines to tide water. In other words, as a result of the fact that we cannot expand our pipeline network to the east and west coasts, we ultimately have to sell 99% of our oil exports to the United States of America, which is the other foreign interest. The refineries south of the border profit from buying Canada's oil at 40% and 50% price discounts and then selling it to the world market at full price. So they buy from Canada at $20 and sell to the world at $50, and they pocket the difference. No wonder these foreign interests don't want Canada to have pipelines. So there's now been documented millions upon millions of dollars that poured into Canada through various forms of internet advertising to dissuade people from supporting pro and development politicians. and ultimately electing an anti-development government. But the victims of that political agenda, which the Prime Minister deliberately played into, have been First Nations people. Let me read from an article in the Financial Post entitled, "We are very disappointed. Loss of Northern Gateway devastating for many First Nations, chiefs say. Most, I'm quoting still, most Aboriginal communities in northern BC impacted by the pipeline supported the $7.9 billion project and are angry the Prime Minister rejected it, say leaders from 3 of the bands." I'm going to continue reading. This is on April the 10th, 2017, Financial Post. Most Aboriginal communities in northern British Columbia impacted by the Northern Gateway pipeline supported the $7.9 billion project and are angry the Prime Minister rejected it, say representatives of 3 bands. Elmer Ghostkeeper of the Buffalo Lake Métis settlement, Chief Elmer Derrick of the Gitxsan Nation, and Dale Swampy of the Samson Cree Nation said on the sidelines of a private meeting in Calgary on Friday with oil patch leaders they are disappointed in the, quote, political decisions which they say was made without their input. Let's stop there for a second. The Prime Minister claims to support the constitutional obligation of consulting with First Nations people on resource projects. But does that consultation only go ahead with those who oppose development? What about consulting those communities who are the majority that support the development? Do they not have the constitutional right to be consulted by their government? Well, in that case, I would challenge the Prime Minister to tell me how many First Nations communities who had benefit agreements in the Northern Gateway pipeline did he meet with and consult personally before he vetoed the project? The article goes on. Again, I'm reading from the Financial Post from April of 2017, Claudia Catania. Quote, "They are now looking for ways to generate new development. Ghostkeeper said more than 20 of the 42 bands of the Alberta to West Coast pipelines right-of-way were looking forward to sharing in the construction and long-term benefits. Their expectations were really raised with a promise of $2 billion set aside in the business and employment opportunities," Ghostkeeper said before addressing the Canadian Energy Executive Association at the Calgary Petroleum Club. Quote, "Energy was offered to Alberta communities, and with the change in government, that was all taken away. We are very disappointed in this young government," end quote. Ghostkeeper said he'd like to see an oil pipeline revived, but led by Aboriginals. Quote, we have to partner with the oil and gas industry and be treated as equals, not as tokens, because any natural resource project that is going to take place on traditional lands has to be given free, informed, and prior consent. The old ways of doing business doesn't cut it," end quote. I continue to quote from the story. Derrick said his band was supportive of from the outset, but the Prime Minister didn't want to hear from supportive communities. Quote, "The fact that the Prime Minister chose not to consult with people in northern BC disappointed us very much," he said. Still quoting from the article, Swampy said some of the bands are discussing legal action against the federal government for rejecting the project without proper consultation. They understand, I'm quoting now, they understand that it was a political decision and not a decision acting in the best interest of Canadians, said Swampy. They weren't asked about the financial effect, the lost employment. They were trying to get themselves out of poverty, the welfare system that they are stuck to, and every time they try to do something like that, it's destroyed. Now let me just repeat that. For the self-righteous anti-development types, such as the Prime Minister, who consistently block these resource projects, let me quote again from this First Nations leader. He says of the local Indigenous communities that wanted this project, they weren't asked about the financial effect, the lost employment. They are trying to get themselves out of poverty. the welfare system that they are stuck to. And every time they try to do something like that, it's destroyed. And that was the effect of the Prime Minister's personal decision to veto the Northern Gateway pipeline. I go on, quoting the article. Saying the Great Bear, quote, the Great Bear Rainforest is no place for a pipeline and the Douglas Channel is no place for a oil tanker traffic, the Prime Minister killed the Northern Gateway last November. Enbridge Inc., the Enbridge Inc. project had received regulatory approval, as well as approval from the previous Conservative government, after a decade of planning and more than $500 million of spending. I mean, think about that. First Nations, entrepreneurs, and the previous Harper government consulted, studied, examined the ecological and economic impacts for a decade. The company spent $500 million on that process. And yet after the Independent Energy Board concluded it was in the public interest and it was environmentally safe, the Prime Minister politically interfered and overturned the decision without consulting with the communities on First Nations that had supported it and counted on it as their best hope to escape poverty. I go on. The Prime Minister also imposed a ban on tanker traffic on the northern BC coast while approving Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline expansion and the upgrading of Enbridge's Line 3. I'll stop quoting right here. Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline. Right. Prime Minister claims he's approved that. Not a single shovel is in the ground all these years later. Not a single inch of steel has been added in pipeline to the Kinder Morgan project. It has been entangled in political obfuscation now for years, even though it must be the least controversial actual project in the history of pipelines. If they're not even seeking a new right-of-way, the pipeline is already there. They're simply looking to twin it so that its capacity can go from the existing 300,000 to 900,000. So far, the Prime Minister has bought the old pipeline, but done nothing to build the new pipeline. The courts have found that once again, he failed to properly consult First Nations communities along the route of the Kinder Morgan project, and has, as a result, had to go back to the drawing board and start all over. And in the process, he has moved as slowly as possible. Do nothing in a mile that can be done in a yard. Do nothing in a yard that can be done in a foot. Do nothing in a foot that can be done in an inch. And so the process inches along. Prime Minister giving vague reassurances that someday, one day, steel will be in the ground and we will begin building this project on which he's already spent $4.5 billion in exchange for nothing we didn't already have. We know his real agenda, though. He is going to get through the next election by trying to convince Canadians who poll shows support pipelines that he does too. And if he gets back in, there will be no pipeline built, just like there hasn't been for the last 3.5 years, because he is ideologically opposed to energy development. He said so. He said he wants to phase out the oil sands. Those were his words.
Shameful.
And he is succeeding. By blocking the 3 pipelines that were ready to go when he took office, Trans Mountain, Northern Gateway, and Energy East, he's landlocked the industry, put 100,000 people out of work, and as I was just saying, has attacked the interests and the autonomy of the Indigenous communities. I was there quoting from the Financial Post in April of 2017. Now, similar groups are coming forward to demand an end to the Prime Minister's tanker ban. You know, the Prime Minister claims he supports pipelines. Right. How are you going to get the oil from the coast to Asia if you're banning tankers? Does he have some magical petroleum-carrying unicorn that is capable of lifting up the oil and taking it to foreign markets? If there is a tanker ban, how could it possibly get where it's going? And so, and I'm quoting right out of the National Post on this, First Nations Coalition calls for rejection of Liberal tanker ban. One group plans to file UN complaint. End quote. So now we have First Nations that are considering going to the UN to fight against the Prime Minister's policies, anti-development policies that keep them in poverty. Quote, the coalition has sketched out plans to build a roughly $18 billion oil pipeline from northern Alberta to around Prince Rupert, BC. A coalition of First Nations groups is imploring Ottawa to rein in an oil tanker ban on the northern BC coast, with one organization planning to level a United Nations complaint against the government to protest the legislation. The plea is a last-ditch effort to reverse Bill C-48 as it nears passage through the Senate. The coalition, composed of the National Coalition of Chiefs, the Indian Resource Council, and the Eagle Spirit Chiefs Council, met with a number of senators Tuesday morning in Ottawa to oppose the moratorium. Calvin Helen, who led the talks with senators, is the CEO of Eagle Spirit Energy Holding, which has sketched out plans to build a roughly $18 billion oil pipeline from northern Alberta to around Prince Rupert, BC. Helen, Alex Qualam BAM member, has long pitched the idea as as Canada's sole First Nations-led pipeline. Helen said C-48 is a matter of enormous concern for the roughly 200 First Nations communities represented by the coalition, and said the Prime Minister's tanker ban explicitly targets the project, effectively stripping Indigenous people of their economic self-determination. Is this what reconciliation is supposed to represent in Canada, he asks. Is that what reconciliation looks like? Then when a group of ambitious and smart and industrious First Nations people come forward with an $18 billion project that could lift whole communities out of the long-term poverty in which they've been trapped and give them full independence and control over their own destiny, that the Prime Minister comes forward with a bill banning them from doing so. Is that what he meant by reconciliation? That is the question that this band member asks as he speaks out against the tanker ban. Because the tanker ban is not just about blocking big oil companies from moving their product, it's about blocking these communities from their one chance to escape poverty. If the Prime Minister believed half as much in reconciliation as he does in his great dramatic and theatrical productions on the subject, then he would consult with and listen to these First Nations people. I asked members of the government, what did he say to Mr. Helen when he put forward C-48, the tanker ban? Did he look him in the eye and tell him that generations of First Nations people in Western Canada will have to be held back because this government is blocking them from achieving economic independence through resource development? Or did he even meet with them at all? My suspicion is that he couldn't be bothered. If there was no camera nearby and no photo opportunity to carry out, then he simply couldn't be bothered to show up for reconciliation. Helen's comments, the article goes on, come amid intense angst in Alberta, which has failed for many years to build the necessary pipelines to carry away steadily increasing oil sands production. the Eagle Spirit Chiefs Council said Tuesday it would file a complaint in coming days under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, against the federal government. I'll stop on this point. Now, there's much legitimate debate about whether the declaration is the best way to achieve reconciliation with First Nations people. But the Prime Minister gave plenty of lip service to that declaration before the last election. And now he appears to have violated it in his tanker ban that prevents First Nations from achieving the economic independence that they have worked so hard to achieve. The article goes on, quoting again from the National Post. The chief said the ban unfairly restricts oil exports to the First Nations group, while allowing multinational corporations to ship their products from the southern portion of the BC coast. So here we go again. Large multinational corporations will continue to ship their product. So this is not even about stopping the shipment of oil and gas. It's just about stopping Canadians from shipping their product. This Prime Minister had never contemplated banning oil tankers from the East Coast arriving at the East Coast. All of those East Coast tankers, they come right across the Atlantic, one tanker after another, into the eastern coast of our country, shipping foreign oil to Canadian markets. And as that oil comes in, our money goes out, and we get poorer and poorer. No wonder our trade deficit is approaching record highs. Now, let me quote further from that National Post article. Quote, "All we're trying to do is take advantage of the resources available to us," said former Chief Wallace Fox, chairman of the Indian Resource Council, a part of the coalition. The Eagle Spirit Pipeline appears to present a conundrum on Indigenous rights. A handful of First Nations communities, including the Yinka Dene Alliance, which oppose the other pipelines in BC, have opposed the project in part due to environmental worries. Meanwhile, a host of Indigenous communities along the pipeline route support Eagle Spirit, while saying it will give them more financial independence. Helen said he is close to a consensus among First Nations on Eagle Spirit. He said much of the First Nations opposition to the pipeline comes from Indigenous people backed by activist organizations who claim to speak for whole communities, but do not. I continue to quote from the National Post there, Mr. Speaker.